This is part 2, chapter number 7, Administrative Changes after 1858. Changes in the Army. The Indian Army was carefully reorganized after 1858, most of all to prevent the recurrence of another revolt. The rulers had seen that their bayonets were only secure foundation of their rule. Several steps were taken to minimize, if not completely eliminate, the capacity of Indian soldiers to revolt. Firstly, the domination of the army by its European branch was carefully guaranteed. The proportion of the Europeans to Indians in the army was raised and fixed to 1 to 2 in Bengal army and 2 to 5 in the Madras and Bombay armies. Moreover, the European troops were kept in key geographical and military positions. The crucial branches of the army, like artillery and later in the 20th century, tanks and armored corps, were put exclusively in European hands. The older policy of excluding Indians from the officer corps was strictly maintained. Till 1914, no Indian could rise to higher than the rank of a Subedar. Secondly, the organization of the Indian section of the army was based on the policy of balance and counterpoise, or divide and rule, so as to prevent its chance of uniting again in the anti-British uprising. Discrimination on the basis of caste, region, and religion was practiced in the recruitment of the army. A fiction was created that Indians consisted of material and non-material classes. Martial, I'm sorry, Indians consisted of martial and non-martial classes. Soldiers from Awadh, Bihar, Central India, and South India who had first helped the British conquer India but had never later taken part in revolt of 1857 were declared to be non-martial. They were no longer taken in the army on large scale. On the other hand, Punjabis, Gurkhas, and Pathans who had assisted in the suppression of the revolt were declared to be martial and were recruited in large numbers. By 1875, half of the British Indian Army was recruited from Punjab. In addition, Indian regiments were made a mixture of various castes and groups which were so placed to balance each other. Communal, caste, tribal, and regional loyalties were encouraged among the soldiers so that the sentiment of nationalism would not grow among them. For example, caste and communal companies were introduced in most regiments. Charles Wood, Secretary of State for India, wrote to the Viceroy Canning in 1861, "I never wish to see again a great army, very much the same in its feeling and prejudices and connections, confident in its strength, and so disposed to rise in rebellion together. If one regiment mutinies, I should have two. I should like to have the next regiment so alien that it would be ready to fire into it." Thus, the Indian Army remained purely a mercenary force. Moreover, every effort was made to keep it separated from the life and thoughts of rest of the population. It was isolated from the nationalist ideas by every possible means. Newspapers, journals, and nationalist publications were prevented from reaching the soldiers, but we shall see later all such efforts failed in the long run, and sections of the Indian Army played an important role in India's struggle for freedom. The Indian Army became in time a very costly military machine. In 1904, it absorbed nearly 52% of the Indian revenues. This was because it served more than one purpose. India, being the most prized colonial possession of the time, had to be constantly defended from the competing imperialisms of Russia, France, and Germany. This led to a big increase in the rise of Indian Army. Secondly, the Indian troops were not maintained for India's defense alone. The Indian Army was the chief instrument for the expansion and consolidation of the British power and possessions in Asia and Africa. Lastly, the British section of the army served as the army of occupation. It was the ultimate guarantee of the British hold over the country. Its cost had, however, to be met by the Indian revenues. It was, in fact, a very heavy burden on them. Public services. We have seen above that Indians had little control over the government of India. They were not permitted to play any part in making of laws or in determining administrative policies. In addition, they were excluded from the bureaucracy which put these policies into practice. All positions of power and responsibility in the administration were occupied by the members of Indian civil service who were recruited through an annual open competitive examination held in London. Indians also could sit in this examination. Satyendranath Tagore, brother of Rabindranath Tagore, was the first Indian to do so successfully in 1863. Almost every year thereafter, one or two Indians joined the coveted ranks of the civil service, but their number was negligible compared to that of the English entrants. In practice, the doors of the civil service remained barred to Indian, for they suffered from numerous handicaps. The competitive examination was held in faraway London. It was conducted through a medium of alien English language. It was based on classical Greek and Latin learning, which could be acquired only after a prolonged and costly course of studies in England. In addition, the maximum age for entry into the civil service was gradually reduced from 23 in 1859 to 19 in 1878. If the young Indian of 23 found it difficult to succeed in the civil service competition, the Indian of 19 found it almost impossible to do so. In other departments, the administration, police, public works, medicine, post and telegraphs, forest, engineering, customs, and later railways, the superior and highly paid posts were likewise reserved for British citizens. The preponderance of Europeans in all strategic posts was not accidental. The rulers of India believed it to be an essential condition for the maintenance of the British supremacy in India. Thus, Lord Kimberley, Secretary of State, laid down in 1893 that it is indispensable that an adequate number of members of the civil service shall always be Europeans. And Viceroy Lord Lansdowne stressed that absolute necessity of keeping government of this widespread empire in European hands if that empire is to be maintained. Under Indian pressure, the different administrative services were gradually Indianized after 1918, but the positions of the control and authority were still kept in the British hands. Moreover, the people soon discovered that Indianization of these services had not put any part of political power in their hands. Indians in these services functioned as agents of British rule and loyally served British imperial purposes. Relations with princely states. The revolt of 1857 led the British to reverse their policy towards the Indian states. Before 1857, they had availed themselves of every opportunity to annex princely states. This policy was now abandoned. Most of the Indian princes had not only remained loyal to the British but had actively aided the latter in suppression of the revolt. As Lord Canning, the Viceroy, put it, they had acted as breakwaters in the storm. Their loyalty was now rewarded with the announcement that their right to adopt heirs would be respected and integrity of their territories guaranteed against future annexation. Moreover, the experience of the revolt had convinced the British authorities that the princely states could serve as useful allies and supporters in the case of popular opposition or revolt. Canning wrote in 1860, "It was long ago said by Sir John Malcolm that if we made all India into Zillas, it was not in the nature of things that our empire should last 50 years, but that if we could keep the number of native states without political power, but as royal instruments, we should exist in India as long as a naval supremacy was maintained." Of the substantial truth of this opinion, I have no doubt, and the recent events have made it more deserving of our attention than ever. It was therefore decided to use the princely states as a firm props for British rule in India. As the British historian P. Roberts remarked, to preserve them as a bulwark of the English has ever since been a principle of British policy. Their perpetuation was, however, only one aspect of the British policy towards the princely states. Their complete subordination to the British authorities. Even before the revolt of 1857, the British had in practice interfered in the internal affairs of the states. In theory, they had been considered a subsidiary but sovereign powers. This position was now entirely changed. As price of their continued existence, the princes were made to acknowledge the Britain as paramount power. In 1876, Queen Victoria assumed the title of the Empress of India and to emphasize British sovereignty over the entire Indian subcontinent. Lord Curzon later made it clear that the princes ruled their states merely as agents of the British crown. The princes accepted the subordinate position and willingly became junior partners in the empire because they were assured of their continued existence as rulers of their states. As paramount power, the British claimed the right to supervise the internal government for the princely states. They not only interfered in the day to day administration through the residents but insisted on appointing and dismissing ministers and other high officials. Sometimes the ruler themselves were removed or deprived of their powers. One motive for such interference was provided by British desire to give the states a modern administration so that their integration with the British India would be complete. This integration and consequent interference was also encouraged by and development of all India railways, postal and telegraph services, currency, and common economic life. Another motive for interference was provided by the growth of popular democratic and nationalist movements in many of the states. On one hand, the British authorities helped the rulers suppress these movements. On the other, they tried to eliminate the most serious of administrative abuses in these states. Administrative policies. The British attitude towards India and consequently their policies in India changed for worse after the revolt of 1857. While before 1857 they had tried, however, half-heartedly and hesitantly to modernize India, they now consciously began to follow reactionary policies. As historian Percival Spear has put it, the Indian government's honeymoon with progress was over. We have seen above how the organs of administrative control in India and civil and in England, the Indian Army and the civil service were reorganized to exclude Indians from an effective share in administration. Previously, at least, lip service had been paid to idea that the British were training and preparing the Indians for self-government and would eventually transfer political power to their hands. The view was now openly put forward that because of their inherent social and cultural defects, the Indians were unfit to rule themselves and that they must be ruled by Britain for an indefinite period. This reactionary policy was reflected in many fields. First, divide and rule. The British had conquered India by taking advantage of the disunity among Indian powers and by playing them against one another. After 1858, they continued to follow the policy of divide and rule by turning princes against the people, province against province, caste against caste, group against group, and above all, Hindus against Muslims. The unity displayed by Hindus and Muslims during the revolt of 1857 had disturbed the foreign rulers. They were determined to break this unity so as to weaken the rising nationalist movement. In fact, they missed no opportunity to do so. Immediately after the revolt, they repressed Muslims, confiscated their lands and property on large scale, and declared Hindus to be their favorites. After 1870, this policy was reversed and an attempt was made to turn upper class and middle class Muslims against the nationalist movement. The government cleverly used the attractions of government service to create split along the religious lines among the educated Indians. Because of industrial and commercial backwardness and the near absence of social services, the educated Indians depended almost entirely on government service employment. There were few other openings for them. This led to keen competition among them for available government posts. The government utilized this competition to fan provincial and communal rivalry and hatred. It promised official favors on communal basis in return for loyalty and so played the educated Muslims against the educated Hindus. Hostility to educated Indians. The government of India had actively encouraged modern education after 1833. The universities of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras were started in 1857, and higher education spread rapidly thereafter. Many British officials commended the refusal by educated Indians to participate in the revolt of 1857. But this favorable official attitude towards the educated Indians soon changed because some of them had begun to use their recently acquired modern knowledge to analyze the imperialistic character of British rule and to put forward demands for Indian participation in administration. The officials became actively hostile to higher education and to the educated Indians. When the latter began to organize a nationalist movement among people and founded the Indian National Congress in 1885, the officials now took active steps to curtail higher education. They sneered at the educated Indians, whom they commonly referred to as Babus. Thus, British turned against the group of Indians who had imbibed modern Western knowledge and who stood for the progress along modern lines. Such progress was, however, opposed to the basic interest and policies of the British imperialism in India. The official opposition of the educated Indians and higher education shows that British rule in India had already exhausted whatever potentialities for progress it originally possessed. Attitude towards zamindars. While being hostile to forward looking educated Indians, the British now turned for friendship to the most reactionary group of Indians, the princes, the zamindars, and the landlords. We have already examined the above changed policy towards the princes and the official attempt to use them as a dam against the rise of popular and nationalist movements. The zamindars and landlords too were placed in the same manner. For example, the lands of most of the talukdars of Awadh were restored to them. The zamindars and landlords were now hailed as the traditional and natural leaders of the Indian people. Their interests and privileges were protected. They were secured in the possession of their land at the cost of peasants and were utilized as counterweights against the nationalist minded intelligentsia. The Viceroy Lord Lytton openly declared in 1876 the Crown of England should henceforth be identified with the hopes, the aspirations, and the sympathies and the interests of the powerful native aristocracy. Zamindars and landlords, in return, recognized that their position was closely bound with the maintenance of the British rule and became its firm supporters. Attitude towards social reforms. As a part of policy of alliance with the conservative classes, the British abandoned their previous policy of helping social reforms. They believed that their measures of social reform, such as the abolition of customs sati and permission to widows to remarry, had had been a major cause of revolt of 1857. They therefore gradually began to side with orthodox opinion and stopped their support to the reformers. Thus, as Jawaharlal Nehru has put it in the discovery of India, because of this natural alliances of the British power with the reactionaries in India, it became the guardian and upholder of many an evil custom and practice, which it otherwise condemned. In fact, British were in this respect the horns of the dilemma. If they favored the social reform and passed laws to this effect, the Orthodox Indians opposed them and declared that the government of foreigners had no right to interfere in the internal social affairs of the Indians. On the other hand, if they did not pass such laws, they helped perpetuate social evils and were condemned by socially progressive Indians. It may, however, be noted that the British did not always remain neutral on social questions. By supporting the status quo, they indirectly gave protection to the existing social evils. Moreover, by encouraging casteism and communalism for political purposes, they actively encouraged social reaction. Extreme backwardness of social services. While social services like education, sanitation, public health, water supply, and rural roads made rapid progress in Europe during the 19th century, in India they remained at an extremely backward level. The government of India spent most of its large income on army and wars and the administrative services and starved the social services. For example, in 1886, of the total net revenue of nearly rupees 47 crore, the government of India spent nearly 19.41 crore on the army and rupees 17 crore on civil administration, but less than 2 crore on education, medicine, and public health. Only rupees 65 lakh on irrigation. The few halting steps that were taken in the direction of providing services like sanitation, water supply, and public health were usually confined to urban areas, and that to the so-called civil lines of British or modern parts of the cities. They mainly served the Europeans and a handful of upper class Indians who lived in the European part of the cities. Labor legislation. The condition of workers in modern factories and plantations in 19th century was miserable. They had to work between 12 and 15 hours a day, and there was no weekly day of rest. Women and children worked same long hours as men. The wages were extremely low, ranging from rupees 2 to 20 per month. The factories were overcrowded, badly lighted, and aired, and completely unhygienic. Work on machines was hazardous, and accidents were very common. The government of India, which was generally pro capitalistic, took some half hearted and totally inadequate steps to mitigate the sorry state of affairs in the modern factories, many of which were owned by Indians. In this, it was only in part moved by humanitarian considerations. The manufacturers of Britain put constant pressure on it to pass factory laws. They were afraid that cheap labor would enable Indian manufacturers to outsell them in the Indian market. The first Indian Factory Act was passed in 1881. The act dealt primarily with the problem of child labor. It laid down that children between 7 to 12 would not work for more than 3 hours a day. Children would also get 4 holidays in a month. The act also provided for the proper fencing of the dangerous machinery, and the second Indian Factories Act was passed in 1891. It provided for a weekly holiday for all workers. Working hours of women were fixed at 11 per day, whereas daily hours of work for children were reduced to 7. Hours of work for men were still left unregulated. Neither of the two acts applied to the British owned tea and coffee plantations. On the contrary, the government gave every help to the foreign planters to exploit their workers in most ruthless manners. Most of the tea plantations were situated in Assam, which was very thinly populated and had an unhealthy climate. Labor to work in plantations had therefore been brought from outside. The planters would not attract workers from outside by paying high wages. Instead, they used to coercion and fraud to recruit them and then keep them as virtual slaves on the plantations. The government of India gave planters full help and passed penal laws in 1863, 65 and 70 and 73 and in 1882 to enable them to do so. Once a laborer had signed a contract to go to work in plantations, he could not refuse to do so. Any breach of contract by a laborer was a criminal offense, and the planter also had the power to arrest him. Better labor laws were, however, passed in 20th century under the pressure of the rising trade union movement. Still, the condition of the Indian working class remained extremely depressed and deplorable. The average worker lived below the margin subsistence, swimming up to the condition of Indian workers under British rule. Professor Eugen Kuneski, she well-known German economic historian, wrote. The well-known German economic historian wrote in 1938. Underfed, housed like animals, without light and air and water, the Indian industrial worker is one of the most exploited in all of the world of industrial capitalism. Restrictions on press. The British had introduced the printing press in India and thus initiated the development of the modern press. The educated Indians had immediately recognized that the press could play a great role in educating public opinion and influencing government policies through criticism and censure. Rammohun Roy, Vidyasagar, Dadabhai Naroji, Justice Rana Day, and Surendranath Banerjee, Lokmanya Tilak, G. Subramanya Iyer, K. C. Karunakara Menon, Madan Mohan Malviya, Lala Lajpat Rai, Bipin Chandra Pal, and other Indian leaders played an important part in starting newspapers and making them a powerful political force. The press gradually became a major weapon of the nationalist movement. The Indian press was freed by restrictions by Charles Metcalfe in 1835. This step was welcomed enthusiastically by the educated Indians. It was one of the reasons why they had for some time supported British rule in India. But the nationalists gradually began to use the press to arouse national consciousness among the people and to sharply criticize the reactionary policies of the government. This turned the officials against the Indian press and they decided to curb its freedom. This was attempted by passing Vernacular Press Act in 1878. This act put serious restrictions on the freedom of the Indian languages newspapers. Indian public opinion was now fully aroused and it protested loudly against the passage of this act. This protest had immediate effect and the act was repealed in 1882. For nearly 25 years thereafter, the Indian press enjoyed considerable freedom, but the rise of the militant Swadeshi and boycott movements after 1905 once again led to the enactment of regressive press laws in 1908 and 1910. Thank you everyone. This was part 2, chapter number 7. We will come back again with the part 3, starting with the next section, that is racial antagonism. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and all the best for your exams.